In a land shaped by mountains and myth, where honor was more precious than life and a single sword could change the course of history, a civilization rose from centuries of chaos and carved a culture unlike any the world has ever seen. This is the story of feudal Japan, an era of samurai and shoguns, poets and peasants, war and wisdom. From the ashes of civil war to the heights of imperial glory, Japan's journey through feudalism forged the soul of a nation. If you're ready to walk the shadowed paths of Kyoto, to witness the rise of the warrior class, and to feel the weight of 1,000 years in every bowed head and every silent shrine, then stay with us. Welcome to Sound, where history breathes, and every word carries the rhythm of time. Before we begin, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and what chapter of Japan's story you'd like us to explore next. Now take a deep breath, and step back into the world of feudal Japan. Chapter 1: The Birth of Feudal Japan. To understand feudal Japan, one must begin by peeling back the layers of myth and tradition that enshroud the nation's earliest historical moments. The origins of Japanese feudalism are not marked by a single dramatic event, as seen in the case of European feudalism following the collapse of the Roman Empire, but rather a slow, organic transformation that took shape across centuries of imperial weakness, aristocratic ambition, and military necessity. Feudalism in Japan evolved gradually, shaped by the terrain, the isolation of the archipelago, and the subtle interplay between tradition and violence. At the heart of early Japanese society lay a reverence for land, lineage, and loyalty, values that would eventually form the foundation of the feudal hierarchy. The first known centralized Japanese state, the Yamato court, emerged in the 4th to 6th centuries AD. It was from here that the imperial family began asserting dominance, claiming divine descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, a narrative that would lend the throne its unshakable legitimacy for centuries. The emperor, viewed as a sacred figure, ruled not by the sword but through a divine mandate that needed no earthly enforcement. However, as time unfolded, it became clear that spiritual sanctity alone was insufficient to maintain real political power. By the 8th and 9th centuries, during the Nara and early Heian periods, the imperial court in Kyoto reached the zenith of its ceremonial sophistication. A sprawling bureaucracy modeled after Tang China flourished. Aristocratic clans, such as the powerful Fujiwara, intermarried with the imperial family, gaining influence and subtly displacing the emperor's direct rule. The Fujiwara often ruled from behind the curtain, manipulating court affairs while preserving the illusion of an unbroken imperial will. It was during this time that the central government attempted to extend its reach across the mountainous Japanese islands, but the reality of geography and logistics made it impossible to govern distant provinces effectively from the capital. As the emperor's power became increasingly ceremonial, the rural provinces drifted into semi-autonomy. Local clan leaders, often descendants of noble families or ambitious warriors, were granted titles like shogun managers, administrators of tax-exempt estates. These landholders eventually became the backbone of the emerging warrior class. They recruited their own private militias to defend their lands, creating bonds of loyalty with retainers that were grounded not in law, but in personal fealty and martial honor. It was in these fertile fields of obligation and survival that the seeds of feudal Japan were sown. Unlike European feudalism, which was constructed upon a strict pyramid of obligations flowing from king to vassal, Japanese feudalism took on a more fluid, layered form. Alliances shifted frequently, and while samurai pledged loyalty to their daimyo lords, those lords could switch allegiances themselves if circumstances demanded. This made for a political environment that was at once precarious and flexible, traits that would define Japanese feudal warfare for centuries. By the 10th century, the court's inability to suppress banditry or enforce law in the countryside led to the rise of warrior families who took justice into their own hands. These warrior clans, such as the Taira and Minamoto, grew in both power and prestige, gradually overtaking the aristocratic courtiers in relevance. The imperial court, locked in ritual and poetry, watched as real power slipped from its grasp. Warfare, once seen as beneath the dignity of noble birth, became the measure of strength and honor. As Japan entered the late Heian period, the stage was set for a new form of governance, one that would rest not on divine right, but on military supremacy. The rise of the samurai class, the growing irrelevance of the central government, and the relentless fracturing of authority across the archipelago all pointed toward the inevitable, the dawn of a feudal age unlike any the world had seen. The old world of courtly refinement had not yet vanished, but its days were numbered. A new order, born of sword and strategy, was emerging. And in its shadows lurked the first true warriors of Japan's feudal era. Men who would write their legacy not with ink and brush, but with steel and blood. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Samurai. In the distant provinces of Japan, far removed from the silken halls of Kyoto, the early whispers of a new warrior class began to echo through the rice fields and mountain passes. These were not echoes of ceremony, but of steel drawn in loyalty, in vengeance, and in the raw instinct to protect land and honor. This was the rise of the samurai. A class of men who would come to define the very soul of feudal Japan for over 600 years. The word samurai itself derives from the verb saburao, meaning to serve, and this etymology captures the essence of their early identity. These were not merely swordsmen or soldiers, they were retainers, loyal vassals bound by oath and blood to a lord. Their rise was not sudden, but rather the culmination of centuries of political decay, rural instability, and the transformation of aristocratic ideals into martial codes. Where the court had once glorified the pen, the provinces began to glorify the sword. As the central imperial government lost its ability to govern the outer reaches of the country, it increasingly turned to local strongmen to maintain order. These men, initially appointed as provincial governors or estate managers, developed independent power bases. They amassed wealth from rice taxation and raised militias from the peasantry. Over time, they began to wear the armor and bear the swords that would distinguish them from both court nobles and commoners. What began as necessity slowly became identity. By the 10th and 11th centuries, clans like the Taira and Minamoto had mastered this new balance of land, leadership, and violence. They were the pioneers of what it meant to be a samurai lord. Not merely a warrior, but a patron, a strategist, and a symbol of strength. Their retainers were fiercely loyal, often pledging not just their lives, but their lineage to the service of a single master. This loyalty, however, was always conditional. The samurai's allegiance was rooted in giri, a sense of duty and obligation, but that obligation was not absolute. If a lord faltered, so too could the bond. It was during this time that the cultural image of the samurai began to coalesce. Armor became standardized, though still ornate. Swords, particularly the tachi, the precursor to the katana, were prized possessions, both as weapons and as marks of status. Horseback archery was the dominant form of battlefield combat, and the samurai were trained to be deadly and precise in both mounted and footed warfare. But the rise of the samurai was not merely a military phenomenon, it was philosophical as well. The evolving concept of bushidō, the way of the warrior, began to take shape. Though not yet a codified doctrine, the early notions of discipline, honor, courage, and unwavering loyalty were already embedded in samurai culture. A warrior's reputation was everything. Bravery in battle could elevate one's house for generations, while cowardice could damn it to obscurity. Tales of personal sacrifice, valiant last stands, and uncompromising revenge began to circulate as moral instruction. In many ways, these warriors were becoming the spiritual heirs to the aristocratic traditions they were replacing, transforming the poetry of the court into the poetry of the battlefield. The power of the samurai was not merely in their arms, but in their organization. Clans functioned like miniature governments, with hierarchies of retainers, vassals, and servants. Castles, rudimentary at first, began to emerge as centers of both defense and administration. These were not yet the grand stone fortresses of later centuries, but they represented the growing autonomy of regional warlords. Each castle was a declaration. This land was ruled not from Kyoto, but from the sword arm of a local master. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai were a class that lived and died by warfare. While aristocrats in the capital wrote verses and debated fashion, the samurai honed their martial skills daily. Children born into samurai families were trained from youth in archery, swordsmanship, horseback riding, and the subtle strategies of battle. They were taught to master death before ever confronting it, to consider life as something already forfeited in the service of honor. By the 12th century, the balance of power in Japan had irreversibly shifted. The emperor remained enthroned in Kyoto, shrouded in tradition, but the real rulers of the land were now men of war. The samurai had risen from the shadows of distant provinces to become the arbiters of authority. And with the brewing tensions between the great warrior clans, the nation stood on the brink of open civil war. The age of the samurai had begun. The imperial court, once the heart of Japan, would soon become little more than a ceremonial echo. In its place would rise a new order. One of armored warlords, shifting alliances, and a blood-soaked struggle for supremacy that would leave its mark on every blade of grass across the islands of Japan. Chapter 3: The Heian Period and the Decline of Imperial Power. The Heian period, which spanned from 794 to 1185 AD, is often remembered as a golden age of art, literature, and aristocratic refinement in Japanese history. The capital city of Heiankyo, modern-day Kyoto, stood as a beacon of elegance, where the imperial court immersed itself in the delicate nuances of poetry, calligraphy, religious ceremony, and aesthetic subtlety. The noble families who surrounded the emperor were the stewards of a world built on beauty, formality, and ancient Chinese ideals adapted to Japanese soil. Yet beneath this graceful surface, the very foundations of political control were crumbling. What began as a period of order and artistic brilliance would, by its end, give way to chaos, militarization, and the birth of a new feudal order. At the center of Heian society was the emperor, whose divine ancestry from the sun goddess Amaterasu remained the spiritual bedrock of the nation. But in practice, the emperor had become a figurehead, a sacred symbol rather than a ruling sovereign. Real power increasingly fell to powerful aristocratic families, particularly the Fujiwara clan, who mastered the art of political manipulation by intermarrying with the imperial line and installing themselves as regents for child emperors. Through cunning and patience, they ruled not in the emperor's name, but in his stead, crafting a courtly system that revolved around familial prestige and influence. This court culture was dazzling but detached from the practical needs of governance. Politics became a game of poetry contests, ceremonial ranks, and whispered intrigues in candlelit corridors. While the capital bathed in the glow of its own self-regard, the provinces, the backbone of the empire's agricultural wealth, grew ever more unruly. Tax revenues became harder to collect. Banditry and local skirmishes increased. And more troublingly, provincial officials often acted as independent rulers, ignoring Kyoto's authority entirely. The imperial court, rather than confront these issues, devised a solution that would ultimately hasten its own demise: the proliferation of shon, or private tax-exempt estates. These estates were granted to temples, aristocrats, and members of the court as rewards or political favors, effectively removing them from state taxation and control. Over time, these shon grew vast and powerful, overseen by local stewards who collected their own revenues and enforced their own rule. Many of these stewards were members of emerging warrior families, who increasingly saw themselves not as servants of the court, but as rulers in their own right. Thus began the erosion of centralized imperial authority, not with a war, but with a slow decentralization of land and power. The very structure that had once supported the court's grandeur now undermined it. As local militias became more necessary to defend these estates, the warrior class, the samurai, rose to prominence. They were not born from the nobility of the court but from the harsh realities of rural conflict, and their worldview was one of discipline, duty, and readiness to die. Their loyalty was not to a distant emperor or a poetic ideal, but to the lord who fed, armed, and protected them. Meanwhile, within the court, a sense of insularity deepened. The nobility continued to compose brilliant works of literature, the Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu being a pinnacle of this culture. But these accomplishments became ever more divorced from the reality outside the capital. The emperor's ministers had lost touch with the land they nominally ruled, and their reliance on military families to enforce order marked a critical turning point in Japan's political history. By the late 11th century, two great warrior clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, had emerged as the dominant powers outside Kyoto. Initially enlisted to quell rebellions and enforce imperial edicts, they quickly learned that the court's authority was fragile, easily manipulated, and ripe for the taking. They turned their military strength against each other and, eventually, against the court itself. The Heian period's final years were marked not by artistic flourishing but by political collapse. Factionalism, weak emperors, and the increasingly bold power plays of the warrior class brought the old order to the brink. In 1156, the Hagen Rebellion erupted, a brief but bloody conflict that exposed the court's helplessness and the growing autonomy of the samurai clans. It was followed by the Heiji Rebellion in 1160, in which the Minamoto suffered a temporary defeat, only to return with greater vengeance in the years to come. What had once been a refined and spiritual age ended in fire and war. The court had built a world of symbols and illusion, and the warriors who rose in its shadow were ready to tear that illusion down. By the time the Genpei War ignited in the late 12th century, the fate of imperial governance was sealed. The decline of the Heian period was not just the fall of a political system, it was the end of an entire worldview. The sword had spoken louder than the brush, and a new chapter in Japanese history, forged in battle and ruled by generals, was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Kamakura Shogunate and the First Military Government. The final embers of the Heian court had barely cooled when Japan was swept into a transformation unlike any in its past. In the bloody wake of the Genpei War, an epic clash between the powerful Taira and Minamoto clans, the old illusion of a divinely governed empire gave way to something unprecedented, a military dictatorship ruling in the emperor's name, yet entirely independent of his control. This was the birth of the Kamakura Shogunate, Japan's first true feudal government, where the samurai class ascended from provincial enforcers to the supreme political force in the land. The Genpei War, which raged from 1180 to 1185, was a brutal and poetic end to the aristocratic era. It was the climax of decades of tension between the Taira clan, who had embedded themselves deeply into the imperial court, and the Minamoto clan, who had built their strength in the provinces and among the rising warrior elite. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Dan no Yura, a dramatic naval engagement in the Inland Sea, where Minamoto forces destroyed the Taira fleet and the child emperor Antoku was drowned by his attendants rather than be captured. The war not only decimated the Taira clan but symbolically cast the emperor's authority into the waves. Victory fell to Minamoto no Yoritamo, a formidable and calculating leader who understood that true power lay not in courtly titles but in the loyalty of armed men. Rather than return full control to the imperial court, Yoritamo made a revolutionary move. He established his headquarters in Kamakura, far from Kyoto, and created a parallel government that would govern the country through military means. In 1192, he was formally granted the title of Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, by the emperor, a title that carried little meaning at first, but would become the cornerstone of feudal rule for centuries to come. The Kamakura shogunate marked a decisive shift in Japanese history. Yoritamo's regime did not abolish the emperor, nor did it discard the imperial court's ceremonial importance. Instead, it left the emperor in Kyoto as a symbolic figure while transferring real power to the shogunate, which controlled land rights, law enforcement, taxation, and military affairs. This dual government structure, known as bakufu, tent government, reflected the fundamental contradiction of feudal Japan. A reverence for the emperor's sacred role, coexisting with the unchallenged authority of the military. Under Yoritamo's rule, a new administrative system took shape. He appointed shogo, military governors, in each province and jito, estate stewards, to manage land and tax collection. These positions were typically granted to trusted samurai retainers, binding them to the shogunate in a web of loyalty that replaced the old court hierarchy. In return for their service, these warriors were rewarded with land rights and the authority to enforce law and order in their territories. It was a system rooted not in ideals of justice or divine rule, but in loyalty, martial ability, and control of resources. But Yoritomo's reign was not without its challenges. His consolidation of power alienated former allies and bred resentment among ambitious relatives, particularly his younger brother Yoshitsune, a legendary warrior who had played a pivotal role in defeating the Taira. Fearing his popularity, Yoritomo eventually had Yoshitsune hunted down and killed, a tragic episode that elevated Yoshitsune to the status of a tragic hero in Japanese folklore. This ruthless pragmatism would become a hallmark of shogunate politics. After Yoritomo's death in 1199, the shogunate faced internal instability. His son and successors lacked his iron grip, and power gradually shifted to the Hojo clan, who served as shikin or regents for the shogun. The Hojo maintained effective control over the Bakufu, creating a hereditary regency that governed from behind the scenes. This layered form of indirect rule allowed the shogunate to survive, even as figurehead shoguns came and went. Despite these political complexities, the Kamakura period was relatively stable, especially compared to the centuries of conflict that preceded it. The samurai class became fully institutionalized, with codes of conduct, property rights, and familial obligations clearly defined. The cultural identity of Japan shifted toward values of duty, austerity, and martial honor. Buddhism, particularly the Zen and Pure Land sects, flourished during this time, providing philosophical frameworks that resonated with the warrior ethos, emphasizing impermanence, discipline, and inner calm. However, the shogunate's greatest test came not from within, but from without. In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire, then the most powerful military force on earth, set its sights on Japan. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China, demanded Japan's submission. When the Kamakura regime refused, the Mongols launched two invasions in 1274 and 1281. The invasions were unlike anything Japan had faced before. The Mongol armies brought new tactics, foreign weapons, and overwhelming numbers. But in both instances, Japan was saved by a stroke of fate, or perhaps, as legend holds, divine intervention. Violent typhoons, later called kamikaze or divine winds, destroyed the Mongol fleets and scattered their armies. The Japanese repelled the invaders, but the effort was costly. Maintaining defensive forces and fortifications drained the Bakufu's resources, and unlike in internal wars, there were no new lands to reward the warriors who fought. This bred dissatisfaction and weakened loyalty among the samurai. By the early 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate was fraying. Its legitimacy was increasingly questioned, its power decentralized, and its hold on the provinces threatened. Samurai loyalty had shifted from gratitude to grievance, and ambitious emperors like Go-Daigo sought to reclaim real power. The winds of rebellion were stirring once again. The Kamakura era had marked the institutional birth of the samurai state, but it had also sown the seeds of future discord. The shogunate had proven that rule by the sword could endure, but it had not yet learned how to sustain peace in a warrior society built on ambition and honor. The next great convulsion of power was coming, and it would tear the country apart once more. Chapter 5: The Mongol Invasions and Their Aftermath. In the annals of feudal Japan, few events carry the gravity and near-mythical resonance of the Mongol invasions. These invasions were more than mere military conflicts, they were existential threats that tested the resolve, unity, and spiritual identity of the newly formed samurai government. For the first time in its history, Japan faced the looming specter of conquest from a foreign empire. And not just any empire, but the Mongol juggernaut, an unstoppable force that had swept across Eurasia, toppling kingdoms and empires with merciless efficiency. The threat began in 1266, when Kublai Khan, the powerful ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China and grandson of Genghis Khan, sent envoys to Japan demanding its submission as a vassal state. Kublai's letters were imperious, a clear indication of the Mongol worldview: those who did not submit would be crushed. The Kamakura shogunate, led at the time by the Hojo regency, dismissed these demands, refusing to bend to foreign pressure. To submit was unthinkable, to defy was dangerous. The tension escalated over several years, as more Mongol emissaries arrived and were rebuffed. In 1274, Kublai acted. A massive fleet carrying over 20,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops sailed from the Korean peninsula and landed on the shores of Kyushu. The invaders brought with them weapons and tactics previously unseen in Japan: coordinated cavalry charges, disciplined infantry formations, siege engines, and even gunpowder bombs that exploded with terrifying force. The samurai, accustomed to individual combat and ritualized duels, were stunned by the brutal efficiency and alien nature of Mongol warfare. These were not warriors who honored the Japanese ideal of one-on-one battle. They fought in masses, used loud drums to coordinate assaults, and gave no quarter. For a time, it seemed as though the Mongols might succeed. The Japanese defenders were pushed back, their cities set ablaze, and the countryside ravaged. But then, unexpectedly, salvation came not from the sword, but from the sky. A violent typhoon swept through the Kyushu coastline, tearing the Mongol fleet apart and forcing the survivors to retreat. Thousands of invaders drowned in the churning sea, and the Japanese declared it a divine miracle. The storm was hailed as a kamikaze, a divine wind sent by the gods to protect the sacred land of the emperor. It was not just a victory, it was a celestial affirmation of Japan's right to remain sovereign. But Kublai Khan was not finished. Furious at the failure, he prepared an even larger invasion. In 1281, 7 years after the first assault, a second and more formidable force set sail, this time with two massive fleets carrying over 140,000 troops, making it one of the largest amphibious invasions in pre-modern history. The Japanese had not been idle in the interim. Expecting another attack, the Kamakura government had fortified the coastline with stone walls, defensive outposts, and a network of samurai across Kyushu ready to repel the enemy. When the Mongols returned, the Japanese fought with renewed vigor, their defensive line stronger, their tactics more coordinated. Battles raged along the coast, and the Japanese launched daring nighttime raids on Mongol ships to prevent a landing. For weeks the fleets remained offshore, unable to establish a firm beachhead. Then, once again, the gods, or fate, intervened. Another powerful typhoon struck. The storm obliterated the anchored fleets, shattering ships against the rocks and drowning tens of thousands of soldiers. The remnants of the Mongol force limped back to the mainland, defeated not just by men, but by nature itself. These twin failures marked the end of Mongol ambitions in Japan. Kublai Khan would never again attempt an invasion, and the Japanese emerged with their sovereignty intact. Yet the victory was not without its costs. The Mongol invasions revealed both the strength and the vulnerability of the Kamakura shogunate. While the samurai had demonstrated great bravery, the military defense had required vast expenditure. Castles, walls, and military mobilization drained the government's treasury. Worse still, unlike previous internal wars, there was no conquered land to distribute as rewards. Samurai who had fought valiantly returned home with honor, but no riches. This sowed seeds of resentment and dissatisfaction within the warrior class, who began to question the leadership of the Hojo regents. Furthermore, the prolonged threat of foreign invasion centralized military authority in the hands of the Bakufu, but also exposed cracks in its administration. The costs of defense were passed on to landholders, and the complex web of vassal loyalty began to strain under the weight of unfulfilled expectations. The inability of the shogunate to adequately compensate its defenders would haunt it in the years to come, as loyalty without reward turned into quiet rebellion. Politically, the failed invasions strengthened a sense of divine destiny in Japanese consciousness. The belief that the gods had protected Japan from foreign subjugation became deeply entrenched in national mythology. It reinforced the idea of Shinkaku, that the divine country, a land blessed and protected by its spiritual heritage. This belief would later be manipulated in darker eras, but in the 13th century, it served to unify the people under a shared sense of sacred purpose. In the years that followed, the Kamakura shogunate became increasingly rigid, bureaucratic, and isolated. The warrior class that had once risen in glory now found itself suffocated by the very system it had helped build. Discontent simmered beneath the surface. And as the memory of Mongol invasion faded, a new threat, one born not from across the sea, but from within the Japanese archipelago, began to rise. A young emperor in Kyoto, ambitious and unwilling to remain a puppet, was watching closely. The divine winds may have swept away the Mongols, but they had not scattered the ambitions of men. A reckoning was coming, one that would see the Kamakura Bakufu tested not by storm or steel from abroad, but by fire and rebellion at home. Chapter 6: The Ashikaga Shogunate and the Muromachi Period. The collapse of the Kamakura shogunate did not happen overnight. It came slowly, like the weakening of old stone, cracked by internal decay, eroded by unfulfilled promises, and finally shattered by ambition from within. As the memory of the Mongol invasions faded into legend and the Hojo regents clung rigidly to their authority, discontent among the warrior class and imperial loyalists grew louder. Into this void of legitimacy stepped Emperor Go-Daigo, a monarch who refused to be content with ceremonial robes and empty rituals. He wanted power, real power, and he was willing to break centuries of precedent to seize it. In 1331, Go-Daigo launched what would become known as the Kemmu Restoration, an audacious rebellion against the Kamakura shogunate. His goal was to restore imperial rule, to sweep away the shogunate's military dictatorship and re-establish the emperor as the true sovereign of Japan. His forces, composed of disaffected samurai, provincial lords, and loyalist warriors, fought valiantly. And in 1333, against all odds, they succeeded. The Kamakura regime was toppled, the Hojo regents overthrown, and Go-Daigo reclaimed the imperial throne with unrestrained authority. But victory soon gave way to disappointment. The emperor, now unshackled, attempted to govern directly through a civilian court bureaucracy that had long since become irrelevant to the realities of samurai rule. He alienated the very warrior class that had helped restore him. Land rewards were denied, old court hierarchies were reinstated, and the samurai, now the backbone of Japan's military structure, were pushed aside once more. It was a fatal miscalculation. Among the disillusioned samurai was Ashikaga Takauji, a brilliant, cunning general from a noble warrior lineage who had initially fought on the emperor's side. But Takauji quickly grew disenchanted with Go-Daigo's rule. He understood what the emperor did not. That Japan was no longer a realm ruled by aristocratic grace, but one that bowed to martial strength. In 1336, Takauji turned against the emperor, marched on Kyoto, and installed a new puppet emperor in his place. Go-Daigo fled south, setting up a rival imperial court in Yoshino, thus beginning the era of the Nanbokucho, or northern and southern courts. This civil war between two competing imperial courts would drag on for decades. But the true winner had already emerged. In 1338, Ashikaga Takauji was granted the title of shogun, establishing the Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi shogunate, named after the district in Kyoto where he built his headquarters. It was a new military government, but unlike the Kamakura regime, which had distanced itself from the capital, the Ashikaga chose to rule from the heart of Kyoto itself. This proximity to the imperial court created both opportunity and danger. Prestige on one hand, and political entanglement on the other. The Muromachi period, which stretched from 1336 to 1573, was marked by contradictions. On the surface, it was a time of cultural brilliance, economic growth, and expanding trade with China. The Ashikaga shoguns patronized Zen Buddhism, supported the flourishing of no theater, ink painting, the tea ceremony, and garden design, elements that would become iconic facets of Japanese aesthetics. Kyoto became a cultural jewel, a place where warrior and artist coexisted in a delicate and often paradoxical balance. But beneath this glittering facade, power was increasingly fragmented. The Ashikaga shogunate never enjoyed the tight, centralized control that the Kamakura regime had once commanded. The authority of the shogun depended on personal alliances with powerful regional lords, or daimyos, who ruled their domains with increasing autonomy. As generations passed, these daimyos grew stronger, while the shogunate's ability to enforce its will weakened. By the mid-15th century, Japan had become a patchwork of semi-independent territories, each ruled by a daimyo who levied taxes, raised armies, and enforced justice within his lands. Loyalty to the shogun was nominal at best, and the Ashikaga increasingly functioned as mediators between feuding lords rather than supreme rulers. Conflict became routine. The Unin War, which erupted in 1467, was a catastrophic civil war between rival samurai factions in Kyoto, sparked by a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family. It devastated the capital, leveled entire districts, and paralyzed the shogunate. The real tragedy of the Unin War was not its outcome, but its aftermath. The central government was shattered, never to recover. Kyoto, once the epicenter of imperial grandeur and Ashikaga authority, descended into anarchy. The war signaled the true beginning of the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, a century of relentless conflict during which regional lords would battle for supremacy, alliances would form and dissolve in the blink of an eye, and Japan would become a land soaked in ambition and blood. The Ashikaga shogunate limped on through the Sengoku period, more a symbol than a government, with successive shoguns holding little real authority. Eventually, in 1573, the last Ashikaga shogun, Yoshiaki, was driven from Kyoto by a rising warlord named Oda Nobunaga, ending the shogunate and closing the curtain on the Muromachi era. Yet despite its political weakness, the Muromachi period was pivotal in shaping the soul of feudal Japan. It was an age of flowering culture, of profound spiritual introspection through Zen, and of shifting power dynamics that set the stage for the unifiers of the next century. The sword had once again proven stronger than the brush, but in the Muromachi era, the two often danced side by side. Chapter 7: The Unin War and the Breakdown of Central Authority. By the mid-15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate was a husk of its former self. Though it remained seated in Kyoto, its influence barely extended beyond the walls of its own district. The authority of the shogun had become a fiction, maintained only by the inertia of tradition and the ornamental respect of ambitious warlords who had little intention of obeying him. It was in this fragile context that Japan would be plunged into the Unin War, a conflict that would not only reduce the imperial capital to ashes but also shatter the already weakened political order, plunging the country into a bloody century of feudal anarchy. The immediate cause of the Unin War was a succession crisis within the Ashikaga family. Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the eighth shogun, was an ineffectual ruler far more interested in aesthetics and cultural pursuits than in politics. Under his patronage, Kyoto flourished with the refined arts, no theater, the tea ceremony, and minimalist garden architecture all blossomed. But while Yoshimasa dreamt in Zen temples and pavilions, the realm decayed around him. His failure to produce an heir until late in life created a vacuum of power, and when his son was finally born, it was too late to quell the rival claims that had already formed. Two powerful factions emerged. On one side stood Hosokawa Katsumoto, supporting Yoshimasa's brother as heir. On the other stood Yamana Suzun, who backed the shogun's infant son. But these were no mere courtiers arguing over succession. Both Hosokawa and Yamana were daimyos, warlords with their own armies, domains, and ambitions. Their personal feud quickly escalated into open warfare, drawing in other clans, and turning Kyoto into a battleground. In 1467, the city was engulfed in civil war. What had begun as a palace intrigue exploded into full-scale urban combat. Kyoto, the ancient capital, the spiritual heart of the empire, was reduced to rubble. Noble mansions, temples, marketplaces, entire neighborhoods were torched in waves of violence. For 10 years, from 1467 to 1477, the Unin War raged, not in the mountains or rice fields, but in the alleyways and palaces of the capital itself. Samurai clashed in the streets, buildings burned, and civilians fled or starved. And yet, even as Kyoto collapsed, no side emerged victorious. The war had no decisive winner. The Hosokawa and Yamana factions bled each other dry. When the conflict ended, it did so not with a treaty or a triumph, but with exhaustion. The city was destroyed. The shogun remained, but with no army to command, no treasury to fund governance, and no authority to enforce law. The imperial court, ever the symbolic soul of the nation, had watched helplessly as its seat of power became a smoking ruin. The true consequence of the Unin War was not merely the devastation of Kyoto, it was the annihilation of centralized control. The Ashikaga shogunate, already brittle, had effectively ceased to function. Across Japan, regional daimyos stopped pretending to serve the shogun and began ruling independently. They built castles, minted local currencies, waged private wars, and ignored orders from Kyoto. Some still maintained the fiction of allegiance, but it was hollow. Authority now came from the sword, and the sword answered only to strength. This marked the beginning of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. A century-long period of ceaseless conflict, shifting alliances, and the rise and fall of powerful warlords. Japan had fractured into dozens of competing domains, each ruled by a local lord with his own ambitions for dominance. Castles dotted the landscape, not just as military strongholds but as administrative centers, around which towns grew. Samurai became not only warriors but bureaucrats and governors, binding the rural economy to the rhythms of war. Ironically, it was also during this time of chaos that Japanese military culture reached its most refined form. Warfare became professionalized, strategies became more sophisticated, and military technologies advanced. Firearms, introduced by the Portuguese in the 1540s, would soon change the dynamics of battle forever. But before gunpowder redefined the battlefield, Japan would endure decades of bloodshed waged with bows, spears, swords, and cunning. The breakdown of central authority did not lead to collapse, it led to transformation. The country became a crucible in which only the strongest, most intelligent, or most ruthless could survive. Small clans were consumed by larger ones. New power centers emerged. And amidst the chaos, a few extraordinary figures began to rise, warlords who dreamed not just of survival, but of unifying all of Japan under their banner. The Unin War, then, was more than a tragedy. It was the violent hinge between two worlds, from a fractured imperial past to the brutal birth of modern Japan. And from its ashes, the stage was now set for the most dramatic, turbulent, and legendary era in Japanese history. Chapter 8, The Sengoku Jidai, Age of Warring States. The Sengoku Jidai, translated as the Warring States period, is one of the most transformative and ferocious chapters in Japanese history. Spanning from the late 15th century until the early 17th century, it was a time when centralized authority had all but vanished and Japan fractured into a mosaic of warlord-controlled territories. Power no longer flowed from the emperor in Kyoto, nor from the shogunate, now reduced to a ceremonial shadow. Instead, it emerged from castle walls, loyal armies, and the cunning minds of regional daimyos who now ruled as kings in all but name. What set the Sengoku Jidai apart from previous civil conflicts was its scale and persistence. It was not one war, but an endless cascade of battles, betrayals, and shifting alliances. Dozens of powerful daimyos fought to expand their domains, subjugate rivals, and climb ever higher in the brutal ladder of power. The land was in constant motion, villages fortified, roads patrolled by samurai, peasants pressed into militias, and rice harvests diverted to feed ever-hungry armies. Each daimyo commanded his own retinue of samurai, ashigaru, foot soldiers, strategists, and castle architects. Warfare became the engine of politics and economy. Victory was not determined merely by strength of arms, but by the ability to form alliances, exploit enemy weaknesses, and govern conquered lands effectively. Castles became crucial. No longer simple hilltop fortresses, they evolved into complex administrative hubs, surrounded by moats, stone walls, and burgeoning towns of artisans and merchants. The very landscape of Japan changed to reflect the rhythms of war. Samurai culture also transformed in this crucible. Though still guided by ideals of bushidō, the code of honor, loyalty, and martial discipline, the realities of Sengoku warfare required adaptability, pragmatism, and a certain ruthless cunning. The romanticized duels of earlier centuries gave way to mass battles, strategic sieges, and a growing reliance on new weaponry. The introduction of the Tanegashima, a matchlock musket brought by Portuguese traders in 1543, revolutionized Japanese warfare. Within decades, Japanese gunsmiths mastered the technology, and firearms were produced domestically in the thousands. Battles that had once been decided by arrow volleys and cavalry charges were now shaped by volleys of coordinated musket fire. Yet for all its violence, the Sengoku era was also a time of extraordinary cultural and social development. Amidst the chaos, towns and trade flourished. Local economies grew around castle towns, fostering networks of artisans, merchants, and laborers who found prosperity in service to the warlords. This gave rise to a new class of townspeople, the kanin, who, though technically beneath samurai in status, began to accumulate wealth and cultural influence. Religion, too, played a dynamic role. Buddhism, especially the militant sects like the Ikoiki, became powerful political players. These leagues of warrior monks and peasant followers established fortified temple complexes and resisted the control of daimyos, at times fielding their own armies and administering vast regions. The relationship between spiritual authority and temporal power grew tangled and often explosive. Christianity also entered the scene during this time. Jesuit missionaries, led by figures like Francis Xavier, arrived in Japan in the mid-16th century and found a surprising number of willing converts among both the peasantry and the nobility. Some daimyos embraced Christianity for spiritual reasons, others for the political and economic benefits it brought, namely, access to Portuguese firearms and trade. For a brief period, a unique fusion of Christian and samurai culture emerged, most notably in Kyushu, where crosses stood atop castle turrets and churches echoed with Japanese hymns. Yet, the age remained defined by its central question: who would reunite Japan? Amidst the myriad of warlords, a few began to rise above the rest, men of singular vision and iron will. These unifiers, as they would come to be known, did not seek mere survival or local control, they sought to conquer all. First among them would be a brutal genius named Oda Nobunaga, who introduced modern warfare to Japan and showed little patience for tradition. Following him would be Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the low-born soldier who rose to power through sheer brilliance and strategic charm. And finally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a master of patience and political timing, who would forge a dynasty to last for over 2 centuries. But before their stories could unfold, the blood of thousands would be spilled, alliances shattered, and kingdoms erased from the map. The Sengoku Jidai was a storm of ambition and carnage, where power belonged to those bold enough to seize it, and peace was a distant, fragile dream. It was an era in which war was the norm, not the exception. And in its relentless crucible, the future of Japan was being forged. Not by emperors or shoguns, but by the will and sword of those who dared to rise above the chaos. Chapter 9, Oda Nobunaga and the Quest for Unification. In the swirling maelstrom of the Sengoku Jidai, where power changed hands with the swing of a sword and loyalty was a coin easily spent, few names struck fear and awe like that of Oda Nobunaga. He was not born a great lord, nor was he cloaked in the noble trappings of Kyoto aristocracy. Instead, Nobunaga emerged from the chaos as a force of nature, unpredictable, brilliant, and utterly unsentimental. It was he who first grasped the sheer scale of the challenge before him, to unite a land carved up by warlords, priests, and rebels. And he understood what it would require: fire, steel, and the will to burn sacred temples if necessary. Born in 1534 in Owari province, Nobunaga was the heir to a minor but strategically positioned clan. Even in youth, he was considered eccentric and unruly, earning the nickname Owari no Outsuk, the Fool of Owari, for his unkempt appearance and disregard for ceremony. But behind his flamboyance lay a cunning mind and a fierce ambition. When his father died, a brutal succession crisis erupted. Nobunaga fought off rivals, including his own relatives, consolidating control of Owari through raw force and strategic marriages. What distinguished Nobunaga was his willingness to break with the past. Where other daimyos clung to ritual and form, Nobunaga embraced the future. He was among the first Japanese warlords to grasp the potential of firearms. In 1575 at the Battle of Nagashino, he revolutionized warfare by organizing volleys of matchlock gunfire in rotating lines, mowing down the famed Takeda cavalry in waves. It was not honor-bound dueling, it was mass, mechanical death. And it worked. But it was not just the battlefield where Nobunaga wielded change like a blade. He abolished traditional road checkpoints that had slowed commerce for centuries. He encouraged free trade, supported merchants, and fostered castle towns as economic hubs. He tore down old barriers of class and privilege, promoting men based on ability rather than birthright. To some, he was a visionary, to others, a dangerous iconoclast. His rise was meteoric. After defeating the powerful Imagawa clan at the Battle of Okahazama in 1560, despite being outnumbered nearly 10-1, Nobunaga's legend was sealed. One by one, he crushed or absorbed neighboring provinces. He formed an uneasy alliance with Tokugawa Ieyasu, and gradually, his domain stretched across central Japan. In 1568, Nobunaga marched into Kyoto, not as a supplicant to the emperor or the shogunate, but as a master returning to claim his inheritance. He installed Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun, only to strip him of power when he resisted becoming a puppet. Within a few years, the Ashikaga shogunate was no more. Abolished by the very man who had pretended to restore it. Nobunaga had no need for symbolic rulers. He would rule in his own name, through sheer dominance. His greatest opposition came from three quarters: rival daimyos, militant Buddhist sects, and the rising tide of peasant rebellions. Most formidable among these were the Iko-Iki, zealous Buddhist leagues who commanded fortified temple complexes and vast peasant armies. Unlike traditional enemies, these warrior monks fought with religious fervor and would not negotiate. Nobunaga's response was brutal. In the late 1570s, he launched a series of devastating campaigns against their strongholds, culminating in the infamous siege of Ishiyama Honganji, the most powerful temple fortress in Japan. After years of fighting, the temple fell, and Nobunaga razed it to the ground. Perhaps the most chilling of his actions came in 1571, when he burned the sacred mountaintop temple complex of Enryakuji to the ground, slaughtering thousands of monks and lay people. To Nobunaga, no tradition was sacred if it opposed unification. He was not cruel for cruelty's sake, he simply saw resistance as something to be crushed completely and decisively, lest it rise again. Despite his iron will and unmatched success, Nobunaga's ambition would not be fully realized. In 1582, at the height of his power, he was betrayed by one of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. While staying at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, Nobunaga was ambushed by Mitsuhide's forces. Outnumbered and caught unprepared, he chose death over capture, committing seppuku as the temple burned around him. His sudden death sent shockwaves through the land. In one stroke, the man who had reshaped Japan's destiny was gone. Yet his vision would not die with him. Within weeks, one of Nobunaga's generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, avenged his master, defeating Akechi at the Battle of Yamazaki. And from the embers of Honnoji, Hideyoshi would take up Nobunaga's mantle, continuing the march toward unification. Oda Nobunaga remains one of the most complex figures in Japanese history. A destroyer and a builder, a tyrant and a revolutionary, he shattered the old world to make way for the new. His path was soaked in blood, but it cleared the way for peace. He did not live to see Japan united, but he made that dream possible. Without Nobunaga, there would be no Hideyoshi, no Tokugawa, no Edo peace. He was, in every sense, the storm before the calm. Chapter 10, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and the Great Unification. In the bloodied wake of Oda Nobunaga's assassination, Japan stood on a precipice. The nation was fractured, warlords still held power in the provinces, and the dream of unification seemed once again threatened by chaos. Yet from this turmoil emerged a figure as unlikely as he was transformative, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. His rise would defy every precedent of samurai society. He was not of noble birth. He had no great lineage, no ancestral castle, no hereditary army. But he possessed an unmatched genius for strategy, politics, and persuasion. In a world ruled by the sword, Hideyoshi proved that the mind could be an even sharper weapon. Hideyoshi was born in 1537 to a poor peasant family in Owari province. His early years were spent in hardship, yet he rose quickly through the ranks of the Oda clan, initially serving Nobunaga in a humble capacity, perhaps as a sandal-bearer, as legend has it. But he impressed his lord with his ingenuity, charisma, and tireless ambition. Nobunaga entrusted him with greater responsibilities, and Hideyoshi proved indispensable. He masterminded sieges, negotiated alliances, and quelled rebellions with surgical precision. By the time of Nobunaga's death in 1582, Hideyoshi was among the most powerful generals in Japan. The betrayal and death of Nobunaga at Honnoji presented Hideyoshi with both a crisis and an opportunity. He moved with stunning speed, confronting the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, just days after the assassination. Mitsuhide was defeated and killed, and Hideyoshi emerged as the avenger of his fallen master. This act cemented his loyalty to Nobunaga's legacy and positioned him as the natural heir to the unification campaign. But Hideyoshi was not content to inherit. He intended to rule. Over the next decade, he systematically outmaneuvered or subdued every rival, including powerful daimyo like Tokugawa Ieyasu, Shibata Katsui, and the Mori clan. Unlike Nobunaga, who crushed his enemies with overwhelming force, Hideyoshi often used diplomacy, manipulation, and political marriages to secure power. His charm was legendary. He could be magnanimous in victory, offering defeated lords honorable positions if they pledged loyalty. In 1585, Hideyoshi achieved national legitimacy by securing the title of Kampuku, imperial regent, a position traditionally reserved for court nobles. Though still technically beneath the emperor, Hideyoshi wielded more real power than any shogun before him. He could not take the title of shogun due to his common birth, but he ruled as effectively as any military dictator in Japanese history. He established a new centralized government based in Osaka, launched sweeping land surveys, and implemented reforms to stabilize the country after centuries of civil war. One of his most significant achievements was the sword hunt of 1588, a nationwide confiscation of weapons from peasants and religious institutions. This policy effectively disarmed the populace, consolidating military power exclusively in the hands of the samurai class. It marked a turning point in Japan's social order, freezing mobility between classes and solidifying the hierarchy that would define the Edo period. Hideyoshi also enforced strict social codes, forbidding peasants from becoming warriors and codifying the roles of merchants, artisans, and samurai. His reforms laid the administrative groundwork for a peaceful, stratified society. He was not only a conqueror, he was a nation builder. By 1590, after the successful siege of Odawara and the submission of the powerful Hojo clan, Hideyoshi had unified Japan under his control. For the first time in over a century, the nation was at peace. Roads were safe, trade flourished, cities expanded, and castles, once symbols of feudal division, now formed a network of centralized governance. Hideyoshi oversaw this transformation with a mixture of charisma, ceremony, and ruthless efficiency. But even the most brilliant minds can overreach. Having unified Japan, Hideyoshi turned his gaze outward. In 1592, he launched an ambitious invasion of Korea, with the ultimate goal of conquering Ming China. It was a campaign fueled by ego, glory, and the desire to make Japan the center of a new East Asian empire. Initially, Japanese forces stormed through Korea with terrifying speed, capturing Seoul and pushing north. But resistance stiffened. Korean guerrilla fighters, aided by Ming reinforcements and a superior navy under Admiral Yi Sun-sin, ground the Japanese advance to a halt. The campaign dragged on for years, consuming resources and lives. Hideyoshi's once impeccable judgment faltered. In 1598, as his health failed, he ordered another assault, but that same year, he died at the age of 61. With his death, the Korean campaign collapsed. Japanese forces retreated, and Hideyoshi's dream of foreign conquest died with him. Though his final years were marred by military failure, Hideyoshi's legacy remained profound. He had taken a fractured, war-torn land and forged it into a single, functioning state. He had elevated himself from peasant to regent, reshaped the samurai class, and transformed Japan's political landscape. Before his death, he entrusted the realm to a council of regents to rule in the name of his young son, Hideyori. But the balance of power was fragile. Ambition stirred once more, and already, a patient, calculating man, once his ally, now a quiet rival, was preparing to make his final move. That man was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Chapter 11, Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Dawn of the Edo Period. Among the triumvirate of unifiers, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the most patient, the most calculating, and ultimately, the most enduring. Where Nobunaga had ruled through sheer force of will and Hideyoshi by a dazzling fusion of diplomacy and ambition, Ieyasu mastered the art of restraint. He understood that in a land weary of bloodshed, the final victor would not be the loudest sword, but the steadiest hand. Ieyasu was born in 1543, into the minor Matsudaira clan of Mikawa province. From a young age, he was hostage, warrior, and tactician. He allied early with Oda Nobunaga, and after Nobunaga's death, pledged loyalty to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, carefully cultivating favor, while quietly building his own base of power in the fertile Tokai region. Unlike many daimyos, Ieyasu avoided unnecessary conflict, choosing instead to strengthen his domain, build capable retainers, and wait for the moment when Japan's political tides would shift in his favor. That moment came in 1598, when Hideyoshi died and left his young son Hideyori in the care of a council of regents, among them, Ieyasu. But trust was thin, and alliances fragile. Hideyori's youth made him a pawn in a looming contest between loyalists who sought to preserve the Toyotomi legacy and those who eyed it hungrily. Ieyasu moved cautiously, using marriages, strategic favors, and quiet subversion to isolate his rivals. But the charade could not last. Tensions erupted into open conflict, and Japan braced for a final reckoning. In 1600, that reckoning came at the Battle of Sekigahara, perhaps the most decisive military engagement in Japanese history. Ieyasu led the Eastern Army, a coalition of daimyos loyal to him or seeking favor. Opposing him was the Western Army, led by Ishida Mitsunari, a fervent Toyotomi loyalist. The battle was a masterclass in patience and timing. Ieyasu's forces were initially outnumbered, but he had carefully sown betrayal within the enemy ranks. At a crucial moment, several Western commanders defected, turning the tide. By day's end, over 30,000 men lay dead, and the fate of Japan had been sealed. Ieyasu emerged from Sekigahara as the unchallenged master of Japan. 3 years later, in 1603, he was granted the title of Sei Taishogun, the same title once held by Minamoto no Yoritomo, officially inaugurating the Tokugawa shogunate. He established his capital at Edo, a quiet fishing village that he would transform into a sprawling center of administration, trade, and power. The Edo period, also called the Tokugawa period, had begun. But unlike the fragile shogunates before him, Ieyasu laid the foundations for a system designed to last. He understood that peace required more than power, it required structure. He implemented a strict social hierarchy. Samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants, each with defined roles and restrictions. The samurai were transformed into bureaucrats and administrators, tied to their lords by stipends rather than land. The daimyos were bound to the regime through a brilliant system known as senkinkotai, alternate attendance, requiring them to live in Edo every other year, leaving their families there as hostages, effectively curbing their ability to rebel. He also enacted laws limiting foreign influence and Christian proselytization, wary of the disruptive power of European traders and missionaries. Over the coming decades, his successors would close Japan's borders almost entirely, initiating over 2 centuries of sakoku, national seclusion. Foreign trade was restricted to a handful of Dutch and Chinese merchants operating in tightly controlled ports like Nagasaki. The goal was clear: preserve order, prevent uprisings, and maintain cultural unity. Though Ieyasu formally retired in 1605, handing power to his son Hidetada, he continued to shape policy from behind the scenes. His greatest concern was securing his legacy. The Toyotomi clan, though defeated, still held symbolic power in Osaka, where Hideyori remained a potential rallying figure for dissidents. In 1614, Ieyasu launched a final campaign, the Siege of Osaka. It was a brutal 2-part assault, ending in 1615 with the destruction of the Toyotomi clan, the burning of Osaka Castle, and the death of Hideyori and his family. With that, all rivals were extinguished. There would be no more wars of unification, no more battles for dominance. Tokugawa Ieyasu had done what none before him had fully accomplished: he had unified Japan not only by force, but by enduring structure. He died the following year, in 1616, and was deified as Tasho Daigongan, his spirit enshrined at the magnificent Nikko Tashogu shrine. His shogunate would endure for over 250 years, presiding over the longest period of peace in Japanese history. Edo would become a sprawling metropolis, and the rigid yet stable Tokugawa order would shape Japan's society, economy, and culture well into the 19th century. Ieyasu was not the most flamboyant of the unifiers, nor the most feared. But he was the most enduring. His genius lay not in conquest, but in consolidation. He built a system that could outlast his lifetime, a clockwork regime of balance, surveillance, and social harmony. The age of the warlords had ended, and the age of peace, rigid, isolated, but serene, had begun. Chapter 12: Life in Tokugawa Japan. With the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate and the final unification of Japan, the nation entered a new epoch, one not defined by bloodshed and rebellion, but by structure, stability, and an intricate web of customs that governed everything from how one bowed to how one walked in the street. This was not just a political peace, it was a social recalibration, a deliberate freezing of the chaos that had once ruled the land. For over 2 centuries, the shoguns of Edo kept Japan firmly sealed from the outside world, and within this closed garden of culture and control, a unique society flourished. At the heart of Tokugawa Japan was a rigid social hierarchy, known as the Shirnokeosho system: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. Though this order seemed to honor traditional values, in practice it reflected the Tokugawa regime's priorities: military control, agricultural stability, and economic containment. At the top stood the samurai, no longer galloping across battlefields, but seated in government offices. They were administrators, tax collectors, legal enforcers, and retainers of the daimyos. Though still revered as warriors, the sword they wore was now more a symbol of status than a tool of war. Most samurai lived on stipends paid by their lords and had little opportunity to fight. For many, the discipline of bushidō, the way of the warrior, became a personal philosophy, a quiet devotion to honor and duty in a world where their traditional role had vanished. Some struggled with this transition, turning to scholarship, poetry, or tea ceremony to fill the void. Beneath them were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Though second in status, they bore the heaviest burden, for it was from the rice fields that the entire economy drew its lifeblood. Rice was not merely food, it was currency. Taxes were levied in rice, stipends paid in rice, wealth measured in how many koku a domain could produce. Peasants were tied to their land and tightly regulated, forbidden from traveling, bearing arms, or engaging in commerce. But despite their restrictions, rural life under the Tokugawa order was often peaceful. Villages developed strong communal systems, festivals, and rituals that gave rhythm to the seasons. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines remained central to spiritual and social life. The artisans, though third in rank, played a vital role in shaping Tokugawa culture. From swordsmiths to weavers, potters to carpenters, their crafts filled the growing castle towns with beauty and function. Urban centers like Kyoto, Osaka, and Edo became hubs of refined craftsmanship. In particular, the ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, woodblock prints depicting city life, landscapes, and courtesans, became wildly popular. Artisans, though restricted by their social status, became silent influencers of Japanese aesthetics. At the bottom of the hierarchy stood the merchants, paradoxically the wealthiest class. Though officially scorned for profiting from others' labor, they flourished in the Tokugawa economy. As peace allowed commerce to bloom, markets expanded, and a vibrant urban culture emerged. Merchant families accumulated fortunes, founded great trading houses, and often sponsored theaters, temples, and artists. They inhabited the shadows of power, quietly shaping the world through money rather than mandate. This complex society was held together by Edo's deeply centralized system. The Senkin-kotai system ensured that daimyos remained loyal by forcing them to spend every other year in Edo, draining their resources and holding their families as de facto hostages. Roads connecting the country to Edo were patrolled and maintained, creating unprecedented internal connectivity. Post towns, inns, and checkpoints formed an elaborate infrastructure of control, communication, and trade. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of Tokugawa Japan was its isolation. After the expulsion of most foreign missionaries and traders, and the outlawing of Christianity, Japan entered a period of sakoku, a self-imposed national seclusion. Only the Dutch and Chinese were permitted limited trade, and only through the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki. No Japanese could leave, no foreigner could enter. The outside world faded into rumor, and Japan turned inward, refining its own culture to a remarkable degree of purity and intricacy. Education spread during this time, particularly among the samurai and merchant classes. Terakoya, temple schools, taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Neo-Confucianism became the ideological backbone of the regime, emphasizing filial piety, social harmony, and hierarchy. Yet within this ordered world, subcultures blossomed. Kabuki theater, geisha entertainment, haiku poetry, and the tea ceremony reached new heights. The floating world of Edo's pleasure districts offered a release from the strict formalities of everyday life, a place of art, music, eroticism, and theatricality. For all its serenity, however, Tokugawa life was not without tension. Natural disasters, earthquakes, fires, famines, periodically devastated the land. The strict social order bred resentment, especially among lower samurai and impoverished farmers. Peasant uprisings flared from time to time, though rarely succeeded. And over time, cracks began to appear in the Tokugawa system, as economic pressures and foreign encroachments slowly chipped away at the walls of isolation. But for nearly 250 years, Japan remained at peace. The sword was sheathed, the nation closed, and a unique civilization flowered in the stillness. This was Tokugawa Japan, not a static land, but a carefully choreographed world where tradition ruled, change was disguised as continuity, and the greatest power of all was the ability to endure. Chapter 13, The Fall of the Tokugawa Shogunate and the Coming of the Meiji Era. For over 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa shoguns ruled a Japan cloaked in calm. The samurai patrolled the streets with swords at their sides, the daimyos paid ritual homage in Edo, and the emperor sat in Kyoto as a distant symbol of spiritual continuity. Beneath this polished veneer of order, however, a quiet storm had been gathering. The very policies that had preserved Tokugawa peace, rigid hierarchy, isolation, and social immobility, began to erode the foundations they once secured. And as the 19th century dawned, the outside world came knocking with cannons, steamships, and foreign flags. The seeds of decline were many. The economic structure of Tokugawa Japan, built on an agrarian foundation and rice-based taxation, began to falter as commerce and urbanization expanded. Merchants, though officially the lowest class, grew increasingly powerful and wealthy, while many samurai, bound by honor and stipends that no longer matched the cost of living, found themselves in debt and discontented. Peasant uprisings and rural unrest became more frequent, as taxes rose and harvests fluctuated. The careful social equilibrium began to buckle. Culturally, Japan remained rich and vibrant, but intellectually, the walls of Sakoku, national isolation, began to feel more like a prison than a sanctuary. Rangaku, or Dutch learning, trickled in through Dejima, offering glimpses of Western science, medicine, and technology. A few curious minds devoured it, sensing a world far beyond Japan's cloistered shores, one that was rapidly changing while Japan stood still. And then, in 1853, the world arrived with black sails and foreign eyes. Commodore Matthew Perry, sent by the United States, arrived in Edo Bay with a fleet of steam-powered warships. His message was direct and unavoidable: open your ports, or we will open them for you. It was a demand, cloaked in diplomacy but backed by overwhelming military force. The Tokugawa government, startled, unprepared, and internally divided, had no choice but to comply. In 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, granting the U.S. access to Japanese ports and establishing a consular presence. This act broke Japan's long-standing isolation, and with it, the illusion of invulnerability. Other Western powers followed swiftly: Britain, Russia, France, all demanding similar privileges, all extracting unequal treaties. Tariff autonomy was stripped, foreign enclaves appeared, and the shogunate's inability to protect Japan's sovereignty became a national humiliation. The crisis was not merely diplomatic. It struck at the core of Japan's identity. For centuries, the shogunate had claimed legitimacy through order and control. Now, as foreign ships prowled Japanese waters, and foreign ideas seeped into Japanese cities, many began to question whether the Tokugawa were fit to rule at all. Anti-shogun sentiment surged, particularly among young samurai in outer domains like Satsuma and Chashu. These domains, once tightly managed under the Tokugawa system, now emerged as the hotbeds of reform and rebellion. Their leaders were educated, ambitious, and increasingly influenced by the cry of Sano Joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. This slogan became a rallying point, not just against Western intrusion, but against the Tokugawa regime itself. Ironically, the more the shogunate tried to modernize in response, forming military academies, importing Western arms, creating diplomatic corps, the more it undermined its own traditional authority. The shogun was no longer the embodiment of continuity, but a desperate figure trying to chase a world that had left him behind. The final blow came in 1867, when Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the 15th and last shogun, formally resigned and returned governing authority to the emperor. It was a strategic retreat meant to preserve Tokugawa influence in a new order. But it was too late. In 1868, imperial loyalists, backed by the modernized armies of Satsuma and Choshu, launched the Boshin War, defeating the Tokugawa remnants in a swift campaign and capturing Edo without extensive bloodshed. That same year, the young Emperor Meiji was restored to supreme power in what would become known as the Meiji Restoration. The centuries-old Tokugawa shogunate was officially abolished, and with it, the feudal system itself. Japan had turned a page. The age of samurai, daimyo, and cloistered rule had ended. In its place rose a modern, industrializing nation-state, hungry to catch up with the Western world, eager to prove itself on the global stage. The Meiji government dismantled the old class system, instituted conscription, modernized the military, and adopted Western legal, educational, and economic frameworks. Railways were laid. Telegraphs stretched across the islands. Factories rose beside ancient temples. Yet even as samurai sheathed their swords for the last time and donned Western uniforms, the memory of the feudal era endured. It lived in the poetry of bushidō, the woodblock prince of Edo, the faded armor in family heirlooms. The Tokugawa period had ended not in chaos, but in transformation. Its long peace gave Japan the strength and cohesion to modernize with astonishing speed. But it was gone all the same. The shogun had fallen. The emperor reigned. And Japan, reborn, now marched toward a new century, one of ambition, empire, and global reckoning. Chapter 14, Legacy of Feudal Japan. The story of feudal Japan did not vanish with the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. It lingered. Etched into the fabric of the nation's culture, institutions, and imagination. For centuries, the Japanese archipelago had been a realm of shifting power, bound by codes of honor and traditions of hierarchy. The warriors who once rode beneath clan banners, the castle towns that flourished behind moats, the rituals that governed life from birth to death, all left marks that would echo far into the modern era. The legacy of feudalism, though officially dismantled in the Meiji Restoration, would continue to shape Japan's identity long after its swords were laid to rest. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is found in the samurai spirit, bushidō, the way of the warrior. Though the samurai class was abolished in the late 19th century, their values of loyalty, discipline, self-sacrifice, and honor became central to Japan's national mythology. Writers and thinkers of the Meiji and Taisho eras repackaged bushidō as a cultural ideal, fusing it with nationalism and morality. It became a guiding ethos in Japan's militarization, a spiritual code invoked during its imperial expansion, and a moral compass in times of trial. Even in defeat after World War II, bushidō remained a cultural cornerstone, later reinterpreted in corporate culture, education, and the arts. The political structure of feudal Japan also left deep marks. Though the daimyo and shogunate were abolished, the centralized bureaucracy crafted by the Tokugawa shogunate laid the groundwork for Japan's modern state. The practice of alternate attendance, senkin-kotai, though originally a method of surveillance, had incidentally created a network of roads, commerce, and infrastructure that the Meiji government would inherit and expand. The Tokugawa system's emphasis on order, hierarchy, and discipline provided the institutional memory upon which modern governance was built. In the realm of culture, the Edo period, the final era of feudal Japan, produced a treasure trove of lasting contributions. The minimalist beauty of wabi-sabi, the quiet depth of haiku poetry, the theatrical spectacle of kabuki, and the intricate traditions of tea ceremony all flourished in that age and remain treasured today. The ukiyo-e prints of Edo artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige not only defined Japanese visual art but profoundly influenced Western Impressionism. Even the concept of mono no aware, the wistful appreciation of impermanence, was born in a world where fleeting cherry blossoms mirrored the lives of warriors. The villages, temples, and castles of the feudal age still dot the Japanese landscape. Some castles, like Himeji and Matsumoto, stand proudly preserved, their white towers rising like silent witnesses to a vanished time. Rural traditions, passed down through generations, still echo with the rhythms of rice planting festivals, ancestor veneration, and seasonal rites first codified centuries ago. In architecture, language, and ceremony, the past lives on. But the legacy is not solely one of poetry and pageantry. Feudal Japan also leaves behind a complex inheritance of inequality and repression. The class system that glorified the samurai also bound peasants to their land, confined merchants to legal inferiority, and excluded women from spheres of power. The sword that symbolized honor also enforced submission. The temples that inspired awe also served as fortresses of social control. In remembering feudal Japan, one must see both its elegance and its cruelty, its wisdom and its walls. Modern Japan has long struggled with this duality. In the early 20th century, the samurai legacy was invoked to justify imperial conquest and martial valor. In the post-war period, it was reimagined as a symbol of cultural pride, resilience, and uniqueness. Today, it lives on in literature, cinema, martial arts, and memory. From Kurosawa films to anime to bushidō-inspired business ethics, the spirit of the feudal age remains a wellspring of inspiration and identity. And yet, perhaps its greatest legacy is philosophical. Feudal Japan was a world in which impermanence was a given, duty was a calling, and harmony was prized above conquest. It was a society that sought balance between discipline and beauty, silence and action, the individual and the collective. In a modern world often marked by fragmentation and speed, the feudal ideal, however mythologized, continues to offer a vision of grounded purpose and rooted living. The castles may be museums, the samurai long extinct, and the shoguns consigned to history. But the echoes of feudal Japan still ring through the cherry blossoms, the calligraphy brushes, the bowed heads of schoolchildren, the lacquered armor in ancestral homes, and the quiet strength of a culture that has never forgotten its past. It was an age that forged a people, not just through blood and conquest, but through the shaping of a national soul. Epilogue: Shadows of the Sword. Beneath the quiet canopy of Japan's ancient forests, where moss curls gently over stone lanterns and the wind stirs through the bamboo groves, there lies a silence that speaks. A silence born not from emptiness, but from centuries of layered memory. Here, in the breath between the mountains and the sea, the spirit of feudal Japan still stirs. Not as a relic in a museum, nor a frozen image on a painted screen, but as a living presence woven into the soul of the nation. For nearly a millennium, Japan was sculpted not only by the chisel of nature, but by the blade of history. It was a realm where the sword was law, where loyalty to one's lord outweighed life itself, and where every action, from the bow of a servant to the calligraphy of a poet, was a thread in a larger tapestry of meaning. Time moved to the rhythm of seasons and rituals. The cherry blossoms bloomed not merely for beauty, but to remind all of the fleetingness of glory, the impermanence of power, the exquisite sadness of all things destined to fade. Feudal Japan was a paradox, a land of great violence and profound stillness, of brutal feuds and sublime philosophy, of rigid control and artistic liberation. Its history was written in fire and ink, in blood and brushstroke. Clans rose and fell like the tides. Emperors reigned without ruling. Shoguns ruled without crowning. Samurai lived by the sword and died by it, yet found time to compose poems about the moon and the sound of cicadas on summer nights. And through it all, the people endured. Farmers bent over paddies, coaxing rice from stubborn soil. Monks copied sutras by lamplight, seeking enlightenment amidst the storms of war. Merchants counted their coins behind paper screens, and artisans shaped wood and clay into forms that would outlast empires. In their silence, they too were warriors, guardians of a culture too deep to be undone by conquest or decree. When at last the old world fell, it did not shatter. It transformed. The samurai laid down their arms, but not their honor. The castles emptied, but the traditions lingered. The emperor emerged from seclusion, not to erase the past, but to carry its weight into a future shaped by steel and steam, by new gods and new wars. And even as Japan sprinted toward modernity, building railways, crafting treaties, clashing with empires. The soul of its feudal age followed, like a shadow at dusk. Today, in Tokyo's neon alleys and Kyoto's temple paths, in the quiet of a tea room or the clash of a kendo match, echoes remain. A bow still carries the gravity of centuries. A poem still whispers the wisdom of warriors long gone. In 1,000 small rituals, how one greets, sits, serves, waits, the ghosts of the past move unseen but not unfelt. Feudal Japan was not just an era. It was a crucible in which the Japanese character was tempered. It was the long forge from which a people emerged, steeled by hardship, softened by art, humbled by nature, and defined by endurance. Its legacy cannot be held in the hand, but it lives in the heart of a nation that once ruled with the sword, and now rules with memory. And so, the tale ends, not in triumph or tragedy, but in transformation. The sword is sheathed, the banners lowered. The war drums silenced. What remains is a story, ancient yet ever alive, told in the rustle of silk, the scent of incense, and the steady, silent steps of a people who have never truly left their past behind. This is Feudal Japan.